Our next chapter is culture and interpersonal communication. In this chapter, we're going to look at how that connects to the interpersonal process. Culture and communication work very closely together. We'll look at some of the values and norms within cultures, co-cultures, and communication, the codes, and how that impacts culture and the interpersonal process, and how to develop an intercultural communication competence. So our goal at the end of this chapter is that you'll have a basic understanding of the relationship between intercultural and interpersonal communication, understand 5 key values that will help you shape a culture's communication norm, learning how to understand those norms or recognizing those norms, and recognizing the range of co-culture in today's society, what co-cultures you belong to, and how those factors can affect interpersonal communication from your perspective and from the other perspective. Look at how verbal and nonverbal is influenced by culture and communication, and begin to understand the importance of learning and grasping the right attitudes, having the knowledge and skills that you need to continue developing your communication competence. So co-culture, it comprises of your culture. Maybe my ethnicity is so for example, my ethnicity is Latina. Culturally, I'm Central American, Nicaraguan. And my co-culture is within those parts. Where do I represent, or where do I belong? So first, it's important to identify the definition of culture, how we're using it in our text. It's the language, value, beliefs, and traditions and customs that are shared and learned. So when we think about this definition, we recognize that culture are those learning aspects of our development. So culturally, ethnically, I'm a Latina, but I'm not the same Latina as another Latina next to me. For example, I'm raised in a Central American family, maybe some similarities to other Central American families, but specifically Nicaraguan traditions and values. But beyond that, what are the traditions and values that my parents have carried over? So culture is a matter of perception and definition. We possess co-cultures. We're part of in-groups, groups that we identify with. Out-groups, those are the groups that we feel different from. And then our social identity is part of our self-concept. So that is based on membership in groups. And then co-cultures involve the perception of membership in a group. For example, as I mentioned, ethnicity, race, geographic region, maybe some things that you have in common, pickleball or riding horses. So within a culture, we have co-cultures, and we develop unique patterns of communication. So within a culture, we have a co-culture. For example, I like to paint. So one of my co-cultures is being a part of a painting group. Another co-culture is being a part of an Inland Empire Latina women's group. So because we're specifically Inland Empire, that's going to separate us from maybe an Orange County Latina group. We will have differences. So there are theories or strategies that are used in communication that we'll highlight, and that is assimilation, accommodation, and separation. These are um, theories that were developed when our behavior with other cultures was observed. So here we will see some of the differences um, and the population where the US who were born in the different locations. I'm not sure how old this is, but it just gives us a preview that European and Canadian might be the largest, but honestly, I think we need to look at this for a current preview. So I mentioned about co-cultures and within cultures. And we want to understand that within these groups and how we identify within those groups socially, we're going to either assimilate, accommodate, or separate. So when we talk about assimilation, that is becoming a part of, assimilating. Accommodating, you're not a part of it, but it's acceptable to you. So, for example, I assimilate to the Nicaraguan culture and the Puerto Rican culture quite easily because I was raised with those cultures. I accommodate with the Mexican American culture because that was another culture that I was exposed to, but I didn't completely identify. Our foods were different, our values were different. There were a lot of things that were different. And then separation, maybe growing up in the 60s, it was difficult to connect with Caucasians. During the 60s, there was a lot of challenges, and so there was a lot of separation from groups. So I stayed more within what was labeled back in that time a brown-black group as opposed to a white group. That was my personal experience. It may be very different today. I'm probably 40 years plus senior, most of you, at least 25 years plus for minimum of you. So things are different. But how do you assimilate? How do you accommodate? Do you have any separation going on? Can you think of examples of yourself in some co-cultural groups that you belong to? And how do these memberships impact your communication? I gave you a brief example of my experience in the 60s, but it's different for each of us. So think about that. Take a moment and pause and jot down some notes. You may want to incorporate that into a short essay or incorporate that into your final paper. All of these notes, I would asterisk them so that you can reflect back on them. Some strategies that have recently been found according to these studies that Latinx students in schools with a white student body typically accommodate while interacting with the dominant culture. So in my example from the 60s, a lot hasn't changed moving forward because we're still accommodating based on this research. Intercultural communication. What do we mean by intercultural communication? Well, it's this process that occurs when a member of two or more cultures or co-cultures exchange messages in a way that is influenced by their different perceptions, cultural perceptions, and their symbol system, both verbally and non-verbally. So I can think about a recent reunion that I attended. This was a reunion of the Cerise Street group. So most of us are in our 60s, and we all grew up together as kids on Cerise Street. And it was really, really cool to bring together as many people that were still alive and come together as a Cerise Street culture. But we also discovered so many differences. In addition, some of the dominant behaviors were still there from when we were kids. So it was interesting to discover that some of the exchanges, while they were intercultural, many of them were free from the cultural influence because of our co-culture, the Cerise Street. So when we think about culture and the degrees of cultural significance in this example, there were some things that we were much more salient to. There was weight attached to our exchanges because of our memories, for example. So it had more weight for us. So I mentioned the term salience, and that's the degree of cultural uh, exchange of the attachment that we have to a particular person or phenomena. So the dimensions of this communication will help us understand the relationship between interpersonal and intercultural communication. There's a matrix, I believe, in your textbook that was presented by Goody Kuntz, that it presents the interaction between the two types, interpersonal and intercultural, and showing that these exchanges, while there are other transactions that might be exclusively intercultural, they did find a lot of personal dimension. And it takes me back to that reunion I shared with you earlier, that we did have a lot of interpersonal exchanges. We shared those stories that we connected with. So intercultural differences can be generalized in multiple ways, number of ways that vary within culture. So there may be a greater difference within a culture than between the cultures. While our Cerise Street group, we were culturally split. So we had Mexican American, we had Nicaraguan, probably a more percentage of Nicaraguans and Caucasian represented, and some family connections. We could see the salience taking place because we identified with each other. We were very connected, even though some of us hadn't seen each other for years. So I found that rather fascinating. So in this example here, we can see where the excuse me, we can see where the categories here, where something is higher on the interpersonal end on the left. So while it uses the example of parent, or we can say relationship, family, there's more of a personal connection. But if you go across to the intercultural exchange, when you think about the spouses, there's going to be more of a difference there because they weren't raised together. So very interesting research done here. And here we can find the dimensions as we bring them together from the formality, excuse me, to a less formal approach. So it really depends on the cultures. You're going to soon learn a description of high and low context cultures, and those are the behaviors within the culture. And we're learning about these cultural norms. And they're very subtle within the values, but you're going to find that there's some similarities in that middle section. So as we came together in our reunion, we had a lot of similarities, but yet there were so many differences because our lives have changed over the past 40 years. So here we're talking about the norms and values of culture. We have a high context culture, low context culture. The United States is very low context because we are primarily vocal. We express our thoughts and our feelings directly. So low context, we'll just tell it like it is. Whereas a high context culture relies heavily on subtle, often nonverbal cues to maintain social harmony. So if you have a friend, let's say from Asia or the Asian nations, that was not raised most of their life here in the US, you're going to see that difference in the high and low context culture. You also see it in Latin American cultures. You'll see the difference in the way maybe one of your peers interacts with their parent, whereas an American born raised will probably challenge their parent a lot quicker than a high context culture. Individualistic cultures primarily focus on themselves. Again, we're low context in the US, and individualistic. Whereas a collectivist culture will feel loyal obligations to their group. So I think about my family in Nicaragua. Many of the children will follow a career of high esteem to satisfy the acceptance of their parents. Doctors, surgeons, dentists, for example, high caliber ambassadors, roles that are at a very high level, if you will. And that is more in a collectivist culture, whereas in an individualistic culture, we chase our dreams. So that's a big difference. Low versus high power distance. So power distance within cultural differences. In a high context environment, power difference is going to be different from a low context environment. Power distance is the degree to which members of a society accept an unequal distribution of power. So a low power distant culture believes in minimizing these distinctions between social classes or a person in a high level status role. Whereas high power distant cultures expect, for example, authority figures to be respected, children to obey their parents and those authority figures, and as they age, that person carries more power within that community. Uncertainty avoidance is used to reflect the degree that a member of a culture feels threatened by an ambiguous situation, in a situation that is not clear, how much they try to avoid them. In a low context culture, we're going to say, I'm sorry, but I really am not getting what you're saying. Where in a high context culture, they may just stay quiet, allow the person to finish what they're saying and say, okay, thank you, and walk away, not even understanding. Very common. We as low context, the majority of us, need to learn to have a balance because it can offend another culture, another person. And we often find ourselves trying to ask individuals subtly to assimilate to our culture. And we have to find a balance. There has to be some accommodation in there. The achievement versus nurturing culture. Achievement cultures, again, low context, tend to regard the supportive relationships. They focus on the task at hand, achievement. So getting things done, reaching your goals. where nurturing cultures tend to regard the support of the relationship being more important. For example, saving face. So we discuss some of these differences in interacting and how they influence you based on how you've been taught. So what is some of the dark side of this? I mean, it all sounds great, right? Yes, we need to be aware of these differences and what it means to you. It's important, if you haven't thought about it, to think about it in your own life, because oftentimes we just carry on and we don't think about the other relationships that we're connected to culturally. And it's important to understand, is it appropriate to be intentional in some situations? How is that person going to take it? A lot of conflict comes from these subtle, simple misunderstandings. So when we think about co-cultures and communication, you know, part of this challenge for us is understanding what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. As a leader, I will say, if you begin to understand and take these concepts in, you will be a stronger leader. Leading isn't just about power, but it's about understanding and accommodating. So consider that in your roles, whatever that may be. So let's look at cultures, co-cultures and communication. So some of the co-cultures I mentioned before: gender, ethnicity, intersectionality, race, disabilities, etc. So race is the category that explains the difference between people by ancestry. Race has no biological basis. It's of little use when we talk about individual differences. Whereas ethnicity is the degree to which a person identifies with a group, usually on the basis of nationality, culture, or some other unifying perspective. Intersectionality describes the interaction or the interplay, if you will, of social categories. For example, a social category would be gender, socioeconomic, sexual orientation, and disability. Those are social categories. And intersectionality describes how these exchanges occur. Gender identity and sexual orientation. LGBTQ. How do we disclose? How do we accept? How do we understand? Oftentimes, culturally, we're challenged by this because many of us might be a part of a high context culture and a low context culture. For example, my parents immigrated as adults to the United States, so they brought in a lot of their high context experiences, but I grew up in a low context environment when I went to school. So being able to be open and being authentic with the others, being supportive, being accepting, you have to be sensitive to people's disclosure and just try not to be judgmental. It's so important to keep ourselves open. And the same with age and generation and disabilities. Oftentimes now that I'm in my 60s, I really feel that difference, that shunning that I feel sometimes, because the aging aren't looked upon as positive or not knowing as much. It's a very interesting decade for me. Some people believe within their culture that an aging person is a very important influence to have in your life, whereas others are very dismissive. Again, there are many strategies that we need to understand. And with disabilities, there's a variety of differences. Some are seen and some are unseen. And so you have to be able to find a fit for those. Adapting and conforming to the dominant group, that's assimilation. Accommodation is acknowledging one's disability and asking for ways that it can be accommodated. Belonging to a community of similar people can be rewarding. Treat a disability not as a defining characteristic, but understand it. And then social class, that social status, it can impact us in multiple ways. Think about regions. Somebody that might live in Orange County, somebody that might live in the Inland Empire. Are they thought of differently, or somebody that lives in Los Angeles, or somebody that lives in New York City? Sometimes we categorize within these co-cultures. Codes and culture. So what are some of those verbal codes? Are we direct or indirect? Are we elaborate or succinct? Formal or informal? So our languages show us so many similarities, but there are also significant differences in our verbal codes within and between language groups. So people feel more confident or more comfortable when they're communicating within their native language or within their own culture. We might do something that's known as code switching when you are dual language, when you have two languages that you speak. So language and identity come together. Um, Being direct and indirect, in some families that indirectness is how they communicate all the time, but when they're out in the field, in their professional field, they're going to be much more direct. Being elaborate, sharing stories, where succinctness is just being direct and to the point. Sometimes it can run into a slight challenge with vagueness, not giving enough information, and of course, formal and informal, depending on who you're with, is going to make a difference. So I mentioned code switching, which is part of the formal versus informal, and code switching is going to allow us to adapt our speaking within the context that we're in, within the environment that we're in. So our communication competence increases if we're successful with code switching. It does not require that you reject, say that you're Latina, but you know that in certain environments you're going to speak Spanish, so that bilingual ability is a plus. And so for certain co-cultures, code switching is a little more serious, involving the adjustment of behaviors and the comfort of others when you're exchanging. And it can also get confusing when you're doing that switching. But I believe that these verbal codes, uh, verbal and nonverbal codes, share many elements within our cultures and our differences. So I mentioned briefly how we share these codes and those differences. So we have many elements of nonverbal. We have a big range of those differences. Again, they're influenced by our co-culture. So how you're going to communicate with me as your instructor and how you communicate with your classmate or a friend is going to be very different. So another really important topic in this chapter is microaggressions. And it's connected to how we communicate with others. So it involves communicating verbally or non-verbally. It can involve a disrespect or a disdain towards another person with a subtle verbal cue. They're most often related to a racial discrimination. And so you want to be careful, and you also want to learn how to respond if you're presented with a microaggression. So an example on this slide is, I didn't know your people acted that way. Or a student calling a difficult test gay, for example. That's kind of old school, but it is something that would impact an event today if it was referred to that way. So what are some of those snubs that you hear? And how do they make you feel? Can you write a list of a couple of microaggressions that you might have experienced? Or maybe you learned that you were an aggressor and didn't realize it. Well, in my case, I can use an example of coming from a high, low context family, a very male dominant. And as a female, I really had to fight and struggle for my voice to be heard. So as I grew professionally, I carried that dominance and that power attitude into the workplace. And it got me into trouble for several years until I learned and understood, wait a minute, I don't have to do this all the time. I'm not at home. So making those adjustments. This is a short video that I'd like you to watch. And I'd like you to consider what you're seeing. What is it that you're seeing? It's a must watch because your discussion will be connected to this. And I think that, let me rephrase that. It's a must watch because I believe a discussion will be related to it. But it's very insightful. It's not to bring judgment on any group, but it's to bring awareness of how a microaggression can be communicated. So take a moment and select the link. If there's any problems with the link, please let me know. How do we develop our competence? After watching that video, wow, it just, for me, impacted me greatly. Trying to understand that even a look is a microaggression. So we need to be very aware and conscientious of how our communication competence is changing. We need to change. All of us do. So motivation and attitude involves the desire to communicate successfully and get along with people of other cultures. Having a tolerance for ambiguity, things that aren't really clear. Let's not overreact. That level of uncertainty can cause us to have certain reactions, but a competent intercultural communicator will welcome ambiguity, try to understand it. Being open-minded, being free of ethnocentrism, the attitude that your culture is superior to everybody else's. Being free from prejudice, having an unfair bias, or being intolerant of others because you're part of the out-group. Do you ever feel that way? Write those things down. Assess yourself. This is a time for you to grow and to develop your communication skills. In this specific chapter, develop it culturally. Knowledge and skill requires you to be mindful. You have to be present. You have to be mindful. Sometimes I'll get messages from students that just really surprise me. One, there's an assumption that I know everything, that I know what you're talking about. There's no clarity. It's very ambiguous, and it's difficult for me, especially when you're under stress and you're just trying to get your message answered, but you're not giving me clarity. You're not giving me a lot of details, and it really causes me to take a step back, to be patient, and try to understand and adapt to what you're seeking from me. And it can be very challenging when you're in a face-to-face situation. So it's really important to develop competence. So use your voice. I think our voice is very important to confront racism or to confront a microaggression, but you have to take action in a positive way. It's important to assert your communication and to be very clear. You don't want to increase a conflict, but you want to increase communication. This is a short video that I thought was interesting that I wanted to leave in the presentation. It's a story about DNA journey. There's a lot of us that we don't know a lot about our past. I just discovered something new about my parents. At 60 plus, I just learned something about my father, and it just shattered my heart. I just cried for like 2 days because something had happened between us, and I never understood why he had the reaction that he did. And hence, 40 years later, I found out something about him, and it made complete sense why he had the reaction that he did. So you might be learning some of those things. I hope you learn about them a lot sooner than I did, but it was truly a healing process for me. So in this chapter, I hope you gain some knowledge about the relationship between intercultural and interpersonal, some of those points, those key values that shape this interaction, understand the many ranges of co-culture and how they affect your interpersonal communication, understand verbal and nonverbal, how that impacts how we communicate with others, and identifying our own attitudes, our knowledge, and our skills required to have successful intercultural interaction. The rest of the slides will include some activities. You're not required to do them, but they might be helpful, they might be of interest. So the rest of these slides, you can go through them. They're on the PowerPoint file. These are just activities that will challenge you, and I hope you find them interesting if any of you decide to do them. Again, these activities are not required. Helpful if some of you do decide to do them. Jot down the notes, jot down the experience, because you can definitely include this in your final paper. For example, I did the intersection of me, myself, and I activity in the cultural chapter, and write about what you discovered. I mean, that could give you a couple of paragraphs. So there's a couple more slides to end this chapter. I hope you found this interesting. Good luck, and we'll see you next time.